This third discussion on Bible prophecy, we'll look at the later prophecies of the Bible, particularly in the book of Jeremiah. Now, Jeremiah was about 600 years prior to the birth of Christ, which puts these prophecies about 2,600 years ago. It's a long time, isn't it? 2,600 years. How did Jeremiah know what to say? We're told in the 30th chapter, which is the chapter we're looking at particularly in this series, 30th chapter, it says in verse 1, the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah saying. So here it is. What Jeremiah is saying is not what he thinks or what he feels or what he would like. What it is, the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah saying, say this. So Jeremiah says it. Now, according to Israeli practice, whenever a prophet prophesied, his words were to be recorded, written down. And if they failed to come to pass, then he was not a prophet. If it did come to pass, then you were to know that this man was surely a prophet from God. The time period is interesting because at this time there was a lot of skirmishes going on between the Babylonians who had come into the land and had taken captives and the Jewish people. Turmoil, war, suffering, problems, deportations. The northern kingdom had already been taken captive 160 odd years previously, all taken off into Assyria. Now the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah, was being attacked by the Babylonians. The cities were being destroyed, the people were being killed, the cattle were being taken away, they were being deported across into the land of the Babylonians. And the word of God comes to Jeremiah. And what are we to make of this? People being taken captive, slain, the land made desolate. So the word of the Lord comes to Jeremiah and says, I want to tell you something about the future of Israel 2,600 years later. So we take up the record in verse 3 of Jeremiah 30. For lo, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will bring again the captivity of my people Israel and Judah, saith the Lord, and I will cause them to return to the land that I gave to their fathers, and they shall possess it. Now, you couldn't get any clearer language. There's time coming, he says, when I'm going to bring Israel and Judah back into the land that I promised to their fathers, they're going to dwell in the land again. Now, some may say, well, surely that happened at the time of the return from the captivity of Babylon under Ezra and Nehemiah. Well, that's a possibility. If the rest of the context of the chapter supports that, then well and good. So what is and I'm only picking out selected parts or selected verses from this 30th chapter, remember that, but I urge you to read the whole chapter to make sure that I'm not plucking the verses out of their context, which is very, very important. So the next verse that I draw your attention to is verse 9. But they shall serve the Lord their God, and David their king, whom I will set up upon them. Now the return from captivity, and the Babylonian captivity under Ezra and Nehemiah, there was no king. They had no king. There was no king. The last king, Zedekiah, was deposed. No other king sat upon the throne of David. So it doesn't refer to the return of Nehemiah and Ezra. It's a future prophecy. Notice the next verse I draw your attention to in verse 11. For I am with thee, saith the Lord, to save thee. Though I make a full end of all nations, whither I have driven thee, yet will I not make a full end of thee, but I will correct thee in measure, and not leave thee altogether unpunished. Then there's a very interesting verse that follows, which says in verse 14, All thy lovers have forsaken thee. They seek thee not, for I've wounded thee with the wound of an enemy, and with the chastisement of a cruel one. For the multitude of thine iniquities, because thy sins are increased. So here was something that God placed upon the children of Israel, so that all those who loved Israel, all those lovers, all those nations that Israel had flirted with over many years, every one of them will forsake her. Then the next interesting verse, in verse 16. Therefore, all they that devour thee shall be devoured. All thine adversaries, every one of them, shall go into captivity, and they that spoil thee shall be a spoil. And all thy prey upon thee will I give for a prey. For I will restore health unto thee. I will heal thee of thy wounds, saith the Lord, because they called thee the outcast, saying, This is Zion, who no man seeketh after. Isn't that amazing what God has to say? The curing, the changing, the afflicting of those nations that have afflicted Israel will be afflicted. Those nations that have spoiled Israel will be spoiled. And God will change the hearts and minds of the nation of Israel. Again, verse 18 is, whether it's a separate prophecy, but it's all in the same chapter as we read it, the 30th chapter, and at verse 18. Thus saith the Lord, Behold, I will bring again the captivity of Jacob's tents, have mercy on his dwelling places. The cities shall be builded upon their own heaps, and the palace shall remain after the manner thereof. Here again, he will bring them, those that he scattered, he'll bring them back into the land and plant them, and they will build. Further on, the ultimate end of this prophecy is this, verse 22. And ye shall be my people, and I will be your God. That hasn't happened yet. That last bit hasn't happened. He's brought them back into the land, but as yet their hearts have not been changed. Neither are they his people in the sense that they see him as their God. And that's the subject of other prophecies which we'll look at in the following evenings.